All right, the last item is just, Jen and I want to provide you just a little budget update. And really, we're looking at the 23-24 budget update. If you remember back in November, after we closed the books for the 21-22, it allowed us to kind of now focus on what the forecast will be looking like, not just this year, but more importantly, next year. So again, that's where we're going to start that information. And so Tim's going to get that updated, and I'm going to join her up there.
Good evening.
Hey, Jen.
Hi, Jen. So some of this you actually have seen because we've talked a little bit about it. Let's see here. Okay. We've talked a little bit about where we were going for 23-24 when we were doing the 22-23 budget, because we saw the size of the budget deficit, and we didn't balance the budget fully with without the use of ESSER funds. And so we knew that we were just essentially going to return to the same work. So this will capture some of that, as well as some other things that we know about our budget for next year. Okay, so if it wants to advance. Oh, do you have to use it? Okay. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about where are we, how we got here, what our next steps are going to be. So again, we're focusing on 22-23, and early indications told us that we would have a significant difference between revenues and expenditures. And early, that's even last year, obviously, because we knew where we were headed, and we didn't finish the work last year. So we do have to present you with a balanced budget in the summer, because you have to adopt it by August 31st. And so the work is well underway to identify potential reductions. So while the numbers that you're going to see are significant as far as the deficit goes, we have done a lot of work. We're just not, it's still kind of imagine like sticky notes on board, still trying to sift through all of it. So a lot of work still being done. So to sort of take a peek back of where we've been and how we got here, 21-22, we'll start with the 21-22 school year. When we closed those books, this was the data that came right off the financial statements. And you can see that our revenues were $7.5 million smaller than our expenditures were. That's not on accident. We knew that was going to happen. So I don't want people to think that we weren't paying attention. We absolutely knew that was going to happen. And the reason that we budgeted that way is because during the pandemic, we actually had we had grown the fund balance, not on purpose, but just the way things rolled out with the pandemic. The fund balance had grown. We didn't need fund balance to be really big. So we intentionally budgeted and did spend it in 2020, 21-22. So that was on purpose. So whereas our fund balance got big, in this year, we spent it down. However, you can't keep doing that. You can't pay your bills every month with a savings account. Well, I guess you could if your savings account was big enough, but ours was not big enough. So we had to reverse that spending pattern to match it up a little better with revenue. So then you look at 22-23, we did do that. We got pretty darn close to the difference between revenues and expenditures about $288,000. But we used one-time ESSER funding to do it. So we still have to correct the $288,000, but obviously that was a big, that was a lot of improvement between the 2 years. So also just a side note, and I won't go over this every time, but at the bottom of most of these slides, you're going to see reference of the source of data, so that nothing that we're going to show you didn't come from an actual report, document, OSPI's website, that kind of a thing. So that if somebody wanted to reference it and go back and find it, they would be able to pull the document. So that'll be on most of them. So that's the previous information. And now what we essentially, a way to think about it is when you build your next budget, you take your current one and you roll it forward and you make changes to it. So we'll identify some changes that we know we're going to make to it. We are not identifying all of them. We don't know all of them because it's still a work in progress for many reasons, but also there's tons of little bitty things coming and going. So we wanted to focus on the big ones, and the top two right there are the big ones, right? Our ESSER money. We use ESSER money. We use $3.3 million to essentially help us not finish all of the reductions that we needed to make for this year. And we did it because we had the money and we would have removed services for students. We tried to keep as much as we could for as long as we could. Removing those services would not have helped. And that's what ESSER was there for. So ESSER was there to help sustain as long as you can. So we used $3.3 million to do that. We also, so that was to cover costs that we currently had that we didn't have the revenue to cover, basic ed revenue to cover. The $4 million, that's for additional supports that we brought in for students and some training as well. So we added some supports to what we had previously and with the 4 million, but we kept what we had previously with the 3.3 million. And there's some examples of some of the underneath the grant funded supports for students. There's some examples of positions and programs that we added throughout this year. The next line item's a little bit confusing. Dr. Vivanco and I talked a little bit about how to say this. So on a slide, there's just didn't seem like the right words or enough words. So we'll give it a shot verbally. So when we were doing the 22-23 budget, you have to estimate, and we'll do this again this year. When we are working on 23-24, we're gonna have to estimate where we think 22-23 will end, because that's going to represent our beginning fund balance for next year. And so when we did that, when we were working on 22-23, we didn't know what it was going to be when the 21-22 year actually finished and we found out what it was. The fund balance was not at 5%, and your board policy states that our fund balance should be 5 to 7% of total expenditures for undesignated or unreserved fund balance. So we did not hit that mark. The board policy also states that we missed it by 0.4%. The board policy also states if you miss it, if you didn't hit it, you have to have a plan to do it. And this is essentially the plan that we are going to roll it into our balancing the budget for next year. Also worth noting, your board policy says 5 to 7% fund balance. It's required by state law that we have fund balance. It's not an extra, it's required by law. And the auditors would say you should have 8. And rating agencies, bond rating agencies would say you should have 12%. We have successfully agreed to disagree with the auditors that 5 to 7 is very reasonable. We manage our finances just fine on 5 to 7. So we will stay in that ballpark unless you guys feel otherwise, but I feel very comfortable with that. And even dipping down with a 0.4, as long as we make it back up, we were fine financially and cash flow wise to be able to do that. So
What generally are other districts? Is
they're
it-
in the same ballpark, yeah. Around 5. 5 is kind of that middle
5.
road. And it's hard because if you're a very small district, 5 is too small because your roof blows off or your boiler goes down. It's the same dollar value. It's a larger percentage of your budget. So little districts have to be in the 10 to 12.
Yeah.
But for our size, it'd be 5-ish, 5 to 7 is perfect. And then fortunately on the slide, there's a positive number, one that's not in red. And that's our levy revenue. So we do have, our voters have approved through 2024 a levy for us. And so we know that dollar amount. So when we bring that levy, the 2024 levy into the 23-24 school year, budget year, it adds $1.4 million. So at least there's a positive one on that. So these
Just
are
to
all
be
numbers.
clear, that was voted on in 2020. 2020.
Yeah,
Has
'cause
nothing to do with.
with-
the
it was a
news.
3-year levy when we did it.
with,
Mhm.
yeah, with
Yeah.
tax
So it has
implications
nothing
starting
to
in
do, it
21.
doesn't have anything to do with the taxes that statements that came out recently. I just want to make sure that's clear.
That is very clear. This revenue increase was connected to what the voters approved, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Yes. The tax statement issue is an error on the treasurer's part or on their software's part. So any questions? These are known. These aren't all the known, but these are the big known.
So these generally won't change.
Correct. So we're gonna get to some estimated. And I'll put my disclaimer out there. Finance folks do not like this estimated piece, and they don't like the estimated because we don't know.
Mhm.
And when you put something out there, there's always the fear that it'll stick. And people will focus on just that number. So please know these are estimates, could be higher, could be lower. But they are simply estimates. And in order to do the work we need to do, we have to have estimates because we have to know
Mhm.
how far we're going. And so we're sharing it publicly and we've shared it with others as well. But again, this is, could be higher, could be lower. Because it's a big number at the end. So big pieces estimate wise, we'll start with wage increases. We have 3 bargaining agreements that are closed. They must have been finished, I think must have last year. And then we have 4 that are open. So we have to estimate how much in wages are we going to have as far as an increase.
Mhm.
So most, and actually this is probably true around the state too, but for us as well, most of our collective bargaining agreements reference wages as it relates to, it references IPD, and IPD is the inflationary factor that the state uses for funding. IPD stands for implicit price deflator. It's just an inflationary calculation. And so what is in most of those agreements is a reference to IPD, which is connected to how the state funds us, plus a percentage. So why that's important is because we don't know what IPD is, so we have to estimate what that's going to be. And I have heard anywhere from 3.8% to 8% is what IPD will be. I don't know where that's going to land. I think 8, I haven't heard 8 in a little while, so that might be on the high side, but I've heard as high as 6.3. So for this piece of estimation, we use 6%. So we use that in that top number to assume a 6% IPD increase, which would roll into a wage increase for our contracts. But if you're going to use it for expenditures, you have to use it for revenues as well. So we also applied it then to revenues that the state would give us, because that's essentially what it's used for at this point, is the state sets it and they set it because that's the amount that they're going to increase your allocations. So I'm going to stop there and make sure that makes sense to you guys.
No.
Okay. That's
There's a
So,
lot.
I'm just clarifying that I understand. So when the state funds us for the IPD, they don't fund all of our staff.
correct.
And so that's why we have a 3.2 number of what the funding will be. And that represents the difference then between the 7.8 and the 33.2 is our gap in what we have to make up in our budget because we're not fully funded. Is that?
That is correct. So the state will just give us IPD, whatever they determine IPD to be. They will give us IPD, but in our contracts, if they read in their IPD plus a percentage, we will cover the plus. In addition, we'll cover the IPD that for non-state funded staff. And actually and the next, I think it's the next slide shows that state breakout that you guys have seen when we do budget. So that's the gap, is the plus, the IPD on non-state funded staff and the additional percentage that's added to that in our bargaining agreements.
Okay.
And just to add, if you recall, Marissa and I and Dr. Caillou, I think, or who was it? No, Larry, we went to the legislators on January 12th. And basically that was our message, the prototypical funding model is not typical, not in Mount Vernon, not in many of our districts. So that's one of the things why when we went on January 12th, we wanted to signal that to them. And as you know, we went recently on February 26th and 27th. That was more systemically statewide on 2 priorities. But again, just an example of how we're trying to advocate for the state to do their paramount duty to fund us at the level that we need funding for our staff.
And it'll get underscored in some, as the slides roll on. That's the challenge. The revenues that we're getting, you guys referenced it at the beginning, right? Our percentage that the state is funding us is shrinking in the total budget.
Mhm.
So while the dollar amount might go up, the amount coming into the state is greater and we're getting a smaller piece of that pie. So we want to reiterate that message at the state level. They're not keeping up with what they should be keeping up with. Because these are wages, these wage increases are deserved. and they're earned. And the fact that they're not keeping up at the state level is causing the local districts to struggle. We're not alone, as you know. I don't know if all 295 of us are going through this exercise, but a very large percentage are. That helping, Wendy?
Mhm.
Okay. So when you add all of those together, you take where we left off for 22, 23, you add the knowns, you add the estimates, because again, these are estimates, could be better, could be worse,
Mhm.
hopefully better.
Yeah.
Our estimated deficit is $10.8 million.
Mhm.
So I want to point out, that's a big number to swallow. It also assumes that previous slide, it also assumes all that ESSER money, including the $4 million in programming that we brought in with ESSER. It has not yet assumed that coming out of it yet either. So as we're working, we're quickly identifying programs that we meant to be 1 year or 2 year only programs that'll be coming out.
Mhm.
But that list we haven't finished that list, and there's things that are ESSER funded that may roll into basic ed depending on what they are. So we don't want to assume just because it's ESSER funded, it will go away. But many of those expenditures were built for the short term. In addition to that, there's things that we're learning every day about why that number could be better. Because I'm going to focus on the things that could be better. So on ways that it could be better. Talk about, this doesn't assume anything that the state might do for special ed funding
Mhm.
or transportation funding. And in fact, we just yesterday got our new funding for this year for transportation, and it's $1.2 million better than what we budgeted. So that was great news that just happened. That will help bring that down right now. Even though it's in this year, it will roll into next year as well. This doesn't assume anything the legislature's doing. It doesn't assume anything that that might hopefully good come our way. It doesn't assume anything negative either that might come our way, but that's just so important to remember. And putting a number up, actually, the funny thing is, in finance school, what they tell you is because you called it an estimate, you should have zeros all on the end. But it didn't have zeros on the end because it started with that, the difference between our revenues and expenditures in 22, 23. So there's a number on the end. It is still very much an estimate.
How's our enrollment looking?
For this year?
Mhm.
Yeah, so we're pretty solid on our enrollment from what we projected.
Okay.
Yeah, and for next year, we've budgeted to shrink a little bit by 88 students. And that's actually going to be a trend that's going to be occurring for us. That's a pretty small amount.
Mhm.
Districts around us in Skagit County are shrinking by larger amounts. So I don't want to confuse that change, that it's part of a real slide.
Mhm.
Birth rates are down
Uh-huh.
Statewide. We heard that.
statewide. Yeah,
We
probably
heard that
nationwide.
when
I
we were
don't
at the
know, but definitely
legislature.
statewide.
We heard about the birth
Yeah.
rate statewide, so it's.
So
not-
what's
not a
happening
local
is
issue.
as those kindergarten classes come in and your 12th graders go out, it's just a natural shift. It's shifting down because the birth rates were down and they're staying down. So
Is that affecting that's part of what is affecting the percentage decrease in overall state funding?
yes, so that
Like
actually,
it would be interesting, like enrollment, what portion, of that, what was it, 51 to 46, the 5%?
that definitely is a piece of it. And actually there was some push at one point during the pandemic when the enrollment decreased. That was a savings for the state.
Mhm.
But they still had the rev. They're not like a school district where we don't have the kids, we don't get the money. They have the money, but they didn't have to pay it out for the students. So there was a push to try and keep that money in K-12 and it wasn't overly effective.
So is that discussed at all?
But that's a really, really good question. So again, there's the source of data. So if you wanted to point to anything. So along those same lines, talking about state funding, this just wouldn't be a presentation if I didn't get to share this. And you guys have seen this multiple times over, but this is a demonstration of how we're state funded versus what our needs are in our district. So two pieces to this part. And this is I'm just focusing on the state, how the state funds us. The state, we tell the state how many students we have. They tell us how many staff they'll pay us for. That's how the funding works. And they see three buckets. They see certificated, classified, and administrative. That's all they see. So the first slice of it is how many kids do you have? I'll tell you how many FTE will pay you for, and this is right off of our budget. Those purpley pinky numbers are right out of our budget of how much the state is budgeted to fund us, how many FTEs. But then you'll see we have a need for the levy to fund some FTEs, and we have quite a few actually funded with state and federal grants. That state basic ed is just the basic ed slice. All the rest of the grants are down below, and then the levy. So we certainly have a lot more staff than the state funds us for. That's slice number one. Slice number two is further down below that. They tell you how many kids are you going to have? Here's how many staff we'll fund you for, and here's how much we will fund you per staff member. And you can see that line. That is the core change in the McCleary, following the McCleary lawsuit and the prototypical funding model. They came out with that piece. They don't care, and they didn't ask how much what is your cost? They said, here's what we're giving you. And this is not the same data in every school district. My guess is the pattern is probably very similar in most districts. But the difference between what our average employee makes in each of those three categories versus what the state funds us for, there's a negative number. There's a negative delta between that. And our levy is picking that up. It's unfunded, but the levy is picking it up. That's what unfunded means to us. Probably means the same thing to most districts. It means that your levy is paying for it. So of the people they say they fund, which isn't even all the staff we have, they don't fully fund them. So that's where our levy comes in. So that calculation down at the bottom, the 5.2 million, the 1.1 and the 1.3, that's the amount of this that's unfunded of the state funded employees. And that's just salary. That's not benefits. So again, revenues are not keeping up with the costs.
When you look at benefits, is it roughly the same percentage of a gap from what's funded to?
It is, because what they do is they take the same number of FTEs and they say, here's how we'll pay you for your benefits. So it's the same, kind of the same math. Yeah. It just adds to that line, makes it larger.
And those are all coming out of levy funds.
They're all coming out of
Those
levy
red
funds.
lines.
Yeah. So staying with the theme of revenues not keeping up with expenditures and that gap that exists, that gap existed and on the day that McCleary was passed for us. That gap didn't exist for every district. In some cases, their funding was higher than what their average cost was. For us, that was never true, which is one of the main reasons that we ended up on the list that OSPI said, oh gosh, this hurt you. Yeah, actually it did.
Sorry.
So that gap has continued just to be sort of the reminder. And that's Dr. Vivanco talked about sharing it when we were down in Olympia. That is what we wanted to share with our legislators. Understand it, please. That's what we want to ask is please understand it. So here's another way to look at the wage piece versus what the state pays us for. So because I mentioned earlier, because most of our collective bargaining agreements reference IPD plus a certain percentage, this is really an outline of how that works. IPD, the state will fund you for an increase of, in the case of 22-23, 5.5, but our wage increases were anywhere from 5.5 to 11%. And that's taking all of our employees. So that's just creating a range for the entire, all of our bargaining agreements is taking a range off of there. And then you can see that playing out year after year. That is taking that gap that the state has not recognized, and it's making it bigger and bigger and bigger. It is, and it's funny, when I was doing this, I was thinking, I have to put it up there, the stuff on the right, the wage increase, but I want to focus on the stuff in the middle because that's not helping us. Because that's all they're funding.
So IPD is driven by inflation? Basically, what's that driven by?
Well, so it is a,
There's a huge increase from 21, 22 to 22, 23.
yeah, so actually IPD was only 2.8% in 22-23, but they did a catch up, which they've never done before, of 2.7 from the prior year. It was a weird deal. And the reason they do that is because they take Our fiscal year, our school year is on a different time frame than the state actually it's a different year. You've got your calendar year, your federal year, your state year, and your school year. So what they do, they do an IPD, or they do that calculation quarterly. They look at inflation quarterly. And so when they do that, the question is, well, what quarters do they put together to identify IPD for a school district? And that's actually being debated right now at the state level. That's not even decided. So the calculation is its own set in stone formula. What quarters you put together to identify APD is a conversation that's being talked about at the state level. And so what they've talked about doing, so right now they estimate a quarter, and that's really what happened in the 21, 22 to 22, 23. They did an estimate and it was too low. So they're thinking about, well, why don't we take when we do IPD, why don't we grab the calculation for quarters that have already occurred? Why are we looking forward? So actually middle of March, you're going to hear a revenue forecast that's going to come from the state. That's a really big deal for them because that's going to include some of this inflationary information. And that's not even the end of the IPD calculation, and that's mid-session, almost near the end of the session for them.
Do you feel confident that our legislators were comprehending and could articulate back to you all the concern?
I don't know, what do you guys think?
Or were they just like,
Um,
uh-huh?
Yeah, I
Uh-huh.
think they're grasping it. And but they have so many other competing priorities. I know one legislator said, well, we have $2 worth of needs, but we only have $1. So how do we have these competing priorities? And we try to remind them, yeah, but one of, 51% of really is your paramount duty. So it's really that broken record conversation. But I really do. I think that the other slide we shared that you pay us for 311 employees, but this is how many we have. And even of the ones that you do provide, you're not providing the revenues needed for what we have. So yeah, but I think there's just so many pieces to it that it's hard to move that needle.
We have more than 50% of our legislators from our districts have kids in public schools. And I'm just curious, what goes through their minds with that.
Yeah, right.
Well, one thing they shared was like 90% of, I think, Washingtonians went through public education. So, and then we talk about the GDP and, they're the taxpayers. So how do we message them?
Okay, thank
We
you.
will keep trying.
Could you tell me what safety net funds cover and whether we budget for that?
Yeah, so safety net used to be a special ed only program that you would apply for what's known as the high cost students that cost over. Clint, I'm gonna put you on the spot. Do you remember what the cutoff, what the first 36,000, 38,000 is ours? Safety net? So the first 37.5 is ours. And if the student costs more than that, you can apply for safety net on them through special education. And so it's in the works right now for this year. They're still working on it for this year, but last year, I think we were just under $1 million that we applied for. And we just so happened to have the safety net expert that works in our district down in their office. And if there's a penny to be found, she'll find it and claim it. There is no amount of money that isn't worth her time to go for. And many districts will say, oh gosh, that's a lot of work for $1,200. That's not the feeling here. So we're actually very successful in doing that. So that helps us keep the amount of levy money that goes for special education down. That helps us keep that dollar amount down. But even with collecting $1 million in safety net, we'll still be $4-5 million of basic ed of levy money that goes to fund the gap, because there's a huge, that is the biggest of all unfunded mandates. There's not funding to cover that. So I love that they're continuing to talk about it at the state level, because I don't know how they could ignore it. And I've even heard legislators on the side almost say, I can't believe you haven't sued us over this, because this, I mean,
Or some talk down there of some other districts thinking about the lawsuit. Because it's they're right,
mhm.
basically. basic human right issue, civil right. So,
Mhm.
yeah, that was brought up a couple of times in our meetings.
Okay.
Are you assuming that we'll get some safety
Yeah.
net funds in the model?
Yep,
Yeah,
we,
okay.
we do that every time.
Is there a cap on safety net?
I don't think so.
No.
So.
Yeah.
Safety net is a reimbursement to the district. We've already expensed those costs.
Mhm.
And so what we're doing is simply trying to recoup funding that we put out for high needs individuals. That cost the district well above the threshold for what we're out.
Okay.
And so consequently, there's not a cap on that, as you mentioned, it's, but the cap is the amount of, it's an archaic model.
Yeah.
It's not an effective model, and it's based off of design from, 15, 20 years ago, and it hasn't kept up with where
Well, our
we operate in today's world.
yeah, our prototypical model is
Yeah,
off.
and
It's
so-
way
so-
off.
So that the cap, if you will, is the human, the work, to put the human capital that we put into it, to try to get that money back. It's only so much work that you can do, and so much time that you can afford.
Yeah.
There are, we are very fortunate, as Jen mentioned. We have the master in our district, Susan Fraley. And thankfully, we have her, otherwise we wouldn't be getting the funds back that we get.
Good.
So I'm actually going to add to,
Thanks, Glenn.
I'm going to add to the safety net question. So that special ed has been the safety net world. They added transportation safety net for the first time this year. We don't know what that looks like because the OSPI can't figure out how to really put it out there for people to calculate. So we don't know. We provided some data a month ago to see if we could help them. So I don't know how that's going to work, but the state did not allocate very much money towards it. And it's the same idea for high cost kids. So for McKinney-Vento students, for special ed students, for foster care students, if there's an increased cost in transporting them, but the amount of money they put towards it is going to be, I mean, Seattle could take the entire amount and not even fill their request. So we don't know what that means, but that is another term that's floating out there. It's transportation safety net. Yeah, good question. So just to reiterate, any of these costs that are not funded by the state or a grant essentially are covered by the levy. And the hardest part about that, there's a legal limit on that. We don't possess the ability to generate our own revenue. So, that's really what's so hard about all of this. Our voters have been very generous with us, but there is still a cap on how much we can ask for a levy, regardless of our generosity of our voters. So, and again, revenues are just not keeping up with the pay increases that our staff deserve. Nobody debates what staff deserve, but they're not all there at the table helping pay for it either. So that's hard. So here's another, this is actually an indicator that finance folks actually ESD looks at it and OSPI looks at it too. And it's another description, another way of demonstrating the fact that revenues aren't in a place that they're covering the costs of wages. And this is really taking a look at how much of the revenue that we bring in is spent on wages. Probably 5 years ago, the OSPI would call me on the phone if they thought if my number was over 80%. Now it's the standard to be over 80. So actually with all of our budget reductions, we did this last year, we got it down to 86%. And the remaining 4% really, and this is what's so hard for school districts, consists of what we're referring to as operational requirements. You can't just eliminate insurance. You can't just not pay your utility bill. And that's those are millions of dollars. You have to put fuel in your buses. You have to buy food to serve in the cafeteria. So just because it's not in people doesn't mean it's not a mission critical expense. So even though there's a 14% left, there's not a lot of flexibility in that either. And that's what districts are really running into is this, oh gosh, I mean, where do I go now? So 22-23 was 86% down from 89. 84, and you can see essentially the pattern, right? We went, I put the slide together backwards. So they went in at the wrong order. So it goes from 1920, which is the year that had our large budget reductions in it. And then it went to 84, 89, and then with more budget reductions down to 86%. There's the source. And I think the next one is, yep, Dr. Vivanco's up.
Which one are you tapping?
Right
Right there, yeah. So, again, as we move to next steps and evaluate our expenditures, we're using, for lack of a better description, these lenses by which we make our decisions. Our strategic plan work, remember we provided you our 22 through 24 strategic plan. And then we really want to look at equitable distribution of resources. So again, we want to make sure that as best we can, that we are doing this proportionately. So, it's always a we, when we talk about Mount Vernon School District, it's all the elementary schools, the middle schools, the high school, it's all of us together. So how can we do that equitably? And that's what we're going to continue to do. And it's student driven. I mean, that's why we're all here. I mean, the reason every single one of us is here is because of our students. So that is really a critical piece. And also for safety reasons, is it legal? Is it contractual? Those are some of the things that we, obviously don't have wiggle room and shouldn't have wiggle room around, because those are the things we have to look at. And again, as Jennifer alluded to earlier or shared earlier, operational requirements, there are things that we need to keep the lights on, kids fed, food, fuel, bus, etc. So those are just other things to keep in mind as we continue with next steps. These are the lenses by which we are trying to make some of those determinations. Also, communication, just as a reminder, we started on February 16th. We met with our district leadership team to share a budget update. And even prior to this, as you recall, back in November, we closed our books from last year. At that time, we had already mentioned that these are some of the things that we'll be facing. So even from November through February, our cabinet team has been having conversations about this and trying to get ready for of where we go next. So we met with our district leadership team. Also, we met with our building principals to share that budget update as well. Also with our labor union partners, we also shared that budget information with them on February 22nd. And we're here now today presenting this to you. Again, as we continue to move forward, we're going to continue to provide updates. As a matter of fact, I'll have a communication that will go out to all staff. I wanted to get in front of you first and then share it with all staff. Basically, here's where we are. Here's where we are right now, and to keep them updated as best we can. And lastly, a couple of other things. Again, you'll see here just a few other things that we, at this point, is where we think we're going. So again, in March, we're looking at building department staffing allocations, and we're going to provide that to them as we speak. Starting March, April, we're going to identify some reductions. Again, through March and May, we're going to share those reduction plans with you, our school board. Budget updates, communicate that through staff from now through the summer. And again, we have bargainings. We have 4 open union contracts, so we want to continue to have that communication, collaboration, conversations with our labor partners. And again, in April, May, continue to communicate these staff reductions to staff. A key important date is April 24th. That's when the last day of the legislative session. Word on the street, as they say, is that they should finish by that day, which is good. That being said, by the time they give all the rules to OSPI to come up with all the rules and all that, that's usually a 4 to 6 week process. So if you do the math, that would be until early June. Well, we have to make decisions, as you know, by May 3rd. So we're trying to do the best we can with information we have in front of us to provide you, the board, with the renewal of certificated staff. So that's just the way it works. But again, as you can see what we're going to be doing the next couple months. We're going to be pretty busy with that. And lastly, in summer, we're going to complete the budget with the adoption no later than August 31st. Again, that might be sooner. It just depends on how we go this, but we know we will do it by August 31st. Because school starts on September 1. No, I'm not sure when, but I know we're working on that as well. But that's, I think, just a quick overview on our next steps as we continue to move forward. And I believe we just want to open up to additional questions you may have.